I'm Janet Drucker, co-owner of Drucker Antiques. We specialize in Georg Jensen Silver, as well as American and English arts and crafts. And today I'm going to talk about Georg Jensen, the Danish silversmith. Georg Jensen was born in 1866 in the countryside outside of Rodvad, which is a small town to the north of Copenhagen. He was born of a family that were working class people. His mother was a housekeeper and his father was a grinder in a knife factory very close by to the home that he lived in this very beautiful, lush countryside in this rural area outside of Copenhagen, which has now become a historic site, and the government has designated many of the homes as preserved homes. They cannot be altered. It is very beautiful. If you visit Copenhagen and you travel by train an hour outside of Copenhagen from the main train station, you can go to the place where Georg Jensen was born. And there is a house that is designated by a plaque that is probably in the same location that his birthplace was. The original home was destroyed years ago, but the government has indicated that it is an important place for people to visit. Many tourists and admirers of Jensen do take the train ride and go out there because it is very lovely. And the national park is Jägersberg National Park. It is a very beautiful, lush area. The story of Jensen's life is a story of a young boy who was talented. His parents recognized his talent and at a very early age, and they knew that they needed to offer him an opportunity to move ahead with this great talent. When he was about 14 years old, the family left this beautiful countryside and moved to Copenhagen in a small flat in a poor area in Copenhagen. But the opportunity for Jensen was so great that he was able to be apprenticed to a goldsmith. And a goldsmith is the name given to anyone who has mastered the gift or the talent, the skill of making gold jewelry and silver jewelry. And while he was apprenticed in Copenhagen to this silversmith, he always had a desire to become a sculptor. Even from the early days when he was a little boy sculpting pieces from clay that he found in the countryside near his home. The first sculpture that Georg Jensen made was this bust of his father. And while he was an apprentice, he gathered enough courage and he went to the Royal Academy of Art and he saw Professor Stein and asked him, could he look at this sculpture and would he give him an opportunity to work in a sculpture studio at the Academy and perhaps become a student. The professor was so impressed with his talent as a young boy that he did in fact give him time and space to become a student at the Academy. And he did progress with his studies. He graduated as a sculptor from the Royal Academy, and he really thought that he was launched on a career of being a sculptor. The problem was that when he tried to exhibit his work, this sculpture of a harvester, it's the first full-size sculpture that he did, it was accepted for an exhibition, but it never sold. And even though it didn't sell, he still thought that he was on his way to becoming a sculptor. Oddly enough, he couldn't earn a living at all at this, so he, with a friend of his, Christian Joachim Peterson, went into the ceramics business, and they had a kiln, and they made ceramics outside of Jensen's home. His friend, Christian Peterson, went on to become the head of the Illuminea porcelain factory, which was very famous and very successful. But unfortunately, the career for Jensen as a sculptor did not materialize. The one good thing that did happen was that Jensen went on to exhibit with his friend at the Paris exhibition in 1900. And they both exhibited this kind of rough piece of ceramic. It's called the Maid on the Jar, and it was an example of Danish art that was exhibited by the Danish government in their exhibit. And Jensen won an award for this. He got a travel award for it, and this allowed him to go to Rome and to Paris and to study and to see other artists at work. And this opportunity offered Jensen a wide view of what the applied arts were in other countries. So he returned to Denmark, and he tried to pursue his silversmithing. Before he did this, he did meet a man called Johan Rode, and Johan Rode was a painter and a sculptor and an architect, and Johan Rode came from a completely different background than Jensen did. He was very sophisticated, very well trained, had a much more comfortable background as compared to Jensen's poor background as a child. But Johan Rode knew that Jensen was a great artist. Just as many people who agreed with Jensen and wanted to collaborate with him, they knew that he had a great talent. And Johan Rode and a friend started an exhibit called the Free Exhibit, which was out of the mainstream of artistic endeavors, very much like our Whitney Annual. It was an opportunity for artists who were rejected by the Royal Academy of Art to exhibit their work. And it was called Den Frie and Stillig. And if you see the cover of the program, it very much looks like the American Arts and Crafts, a woodcut that was typical of the kind of illustrations we used in America. At the same time that the arts and crafts movement was progressing in America, the arts and crafts movement that emerged in Denmark was called skoenwerk. And this belt buckle that is an example of it is an example of what we call Danish arts and crafts. And what it really signifies is a very unique approach. It was an approach where the artist became the craftsman. And this was a novelty because it had never been done before. It was always the artist who submitted a design to a craftsperson, and the craftsperson could then incorporate it. And this skoenwerk tradition was a tradition where the artist and the designer became one. And if you think about it in that context, you will understand that is a revolutionary idea. At the same time, Jensen was progressing with his silverwork. He was very much involved with making jewelry and small objects for other artists and other sculptors. And one of the things that he did was earn a living at this silversmithing because he couldn't do it through the sculpture. So what he did was work as a foreman for Mogens Ballen, who had a workshop in Copenhagen. And this Adam and Eve buckle, which was done in 1899 by Georg Jensen, was an example of his early work when he was searching for an identity and a national style for himself. And he went on with great success in these small pieces that he was creating. And when Mogens Ballen closed his workshop in 1904, Jensen needed a vehicle so that he could move on and do his own work. And he opened a very small shop at 36 Bredgade, above a little archway, and it's still there. And at that time, Bredgade was the most fashionable street in Copenhagen. one of the first things that he made was jewelry, because you needed much less silver for jewelry than you needed for hollowware. When he did make a piece of hollowware, it was this blossom teapot with an ivory handle. It's called number 2, and it was a very beautiful teapot and inspired by the nature and the surroundings of his youth, the landscape of that little town, Ralval, where he grew up, of the foliage, the buds, the birds, and the trees. And he very often referred to his inspiration of the landscape of his childhood, and that it was his father who inspired him to appreciate it. So in all the things that we will see about Georg Jensen, you will be able to trace the origins of the motifs that he used. Some of the first pieces of jewelry that Jensen made were typical of the kinds of things that women wore in those days. We're talking about the beginning of the 20th century. And in the early 1900s, women had big bouffant hairdos and needed combs to hold it down. They wore big hats. He made lots of hat pins. He made combs out of tortoise. He made big pins and buckles. There's a wonderful buckle with 2 birds on it facing opposite sides, and it is now in the Museum of Decorative Arts in Copenhagen. And that design was a design that Jensen purchased from Mole Hansen, who was another artist painter. This idea of purchasing a design from an artist was a very, I won't say a very common or procedural way to acquire good designs from artists who were not silversmiths or goldsmiths. And it was a procedure that was used in England by Arthur Lazenby Liberty when he went forth with Liberty and Company. He did the same thing. He purchased designs from other artists like Ashby and Knox and Horner, and went on and paid them a certain amount of money. In England it was pounds, and went on and incorporated their designs into what he used as a commercial design. Jensen did not really know about commercial or mass production. He was really interested in handwork, and his idea was to integrate the concepts of the arts and crafts tradition, which was espoused by William Morris and John Ruskin, to appreciate the artistic endeavor rather than to appreciate the amount of gold or silver or the stones or diamonds that were in a piece or an object. You can see that the company really progressed because Jensen won many awards throughout international expositions where he exhibited. And if we look at some of the storefronts that emerged, the store in Berlin was the first international store in 1909. And there was an art dealer who was named Carl Dyer. He opened a very elegant store in Berlin. He was actually a Danish art dealer, and he convinced Jensen that he loved Jensen so much, and that he would go to Berlin and open an international store. And what he did was he called the store the Danish Silversmith. And it was marked on the store, the Danish Silversmith. And the First World War forced the store to close, although this was the largest market for Jensen silver. What was an interesting idea about what Dyer did was that he not only sold Georg Jensen, but he did very much what I'm doing. He lectured about Georg Jensen's life. He talked about his art, he talked about his silver, he talked about his love of producing work for people of modest means, of women in Copenhagen being able to enjoy the beauty of a piece of silver, of making silver that was not made for kings and queens as in the past. He talked about Jensen's message of bringing silver into the world of art and bringing it to the world of everyday life, which was a very revolutionary idea. So that Mr. Dyer was the first, I call, messenger of Jensen. And as we continue and the story emerges, you will see that there are others. And I do tell a great deal about the intricacies of how this emerged in the book. So you can always look in the book, Georg Jensen, A Tradition of Splendid Silver, and you can get many more details about it. There was a store in Stockholm. Sweden did replace the lost market that emerged in Germany. In 1914, there was a Baltic exhibition in Malmo, where a very large exhibition of Jensen's work was shown. And the second messenger of Georg Jensen was a man by the name of Niels Wendel. He bought the entire collection that was exhibited. He then became the largest Jensen customer, replacing the lost market in Germany. So you can see that the smithy in Copenhagen constantly was finding another market so that they could keep the production going. There were about 250 employees in the Jensen smithy by 1924. And it's also interesting to note that the silversmiths at that time in the smithy, when we look at their picture, they all wore white lab coats. It's almost as if they were in a laboratory. They wore ties and shirts, as business people do. I once heard a lecture about Fabergé, and the lecturer indicated how interesting and how important it was that the people who worked in the Fabergé laboratory workshop also wore lab coats. It might have been typical of a craftsman's garb at that time. Georg Jensen wore a lab coat. He always wore a kind of smock rather than a lab coat because he saw himself as an artist. On the door of his shop, it said silversmith. It also said sculptor. Georg Jensen saw himself as a silversmith and a sculptor. There is a store in Paris at the Rue Saint-Honoré. The shop opened in 1918. It is still there today. And sometimes we see correspondence or different vehicles that the Jensen store used. One of the interesting ideas was that when the Jensen smithy sent out a greeting card, they sent it out with an anvil so that you can see. They wanted very much to impart to the public that this was a hand-wrought workshop. And one of the important events in the growth of Georg Jensen as a company, because we have to remember that Georg Jensen was a man, he was a style that he developed, and it also is a company that still exists today. When Georg Jensen started, it was a small atelier with one man and an apprentice and one helper. And around 1915, the smithy was looking for another venue, another vehicle, since they had lost so much business in Europe because of the world situation. And at that time, there were exhibitions and expositions that were international. In 1915, there was a Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, and many nations participated in it, and one of the participants was Denmark, and Georg Jensen sent an exhibition to the Panama Pacific Exposition. A man went and brought the work. What was interesting was the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst went to the exhibition, and as was his practice, if he liked the craft and he liked the work, he very often would buy the whole thing. Well, he bought all of what was exhibited at the Jensen exhibition. And what was interesting about this was that because George Randolph Hearst did this, many Americans thought, if it's good enough for George Randolph Hearst, it might be interesting to buy. Well, the third person that was an emissary of George Jensen Silver was a man called Frederick Lunning. And he decided, after being a salesman in Copenhagen and Bledgard, he was first an art dealer, like Carl Dyer in Denmark. He decided that he would become a salesman for George Jensen. He loved Jensen as much as Dyer did, as much as Niels Wendel did. And what happened was he knew that the smithy was needing another venue. They needed another marketplace. And when he heard that the exhibition at Panama Pacific was so great, he decided that he would convince the company that he should take Jensen Silver and go off to America, and he'll try to sell it. Well, what he did was he went to America with several trunks, and the story of Frederick Lunning and his growth and how the Lunning store, the George Jensen handmade store, grew in America is a unique story, an interesting story, and very pertinent to the American market. And I do tell a great deal of the story in the Jensen book. It is interesting because it really tells about how Americans took to Jensen Silver and loved it, and then went back to Copenhagen and bought it, and how they bought it in all the stores all over the world. And when Frederick Lunning opened, he opened by selling in small art gallery exhibits that he held at the Waldorf and at other places, at good hotels, and invited wealthy clientele. And eventually he convinced the people in Copenhagen that he should open a store, and he did. He opened a store opposite Carnegie Hall on 57th Street. And you can see an advertisement for the Jensen Silver and how it was marketed. It was always marketed in America as artistic silver. It always listed the grand prizes that Jensen Silver was awarded in San Francisco and Barcelona in 1923 and Rio de Janeiro in 1923. And the advertisement also indicates the international market for George Jensen Silver by indicating there was a store in London, there was a store in Paris, there was a store in New York and in Copenhagen. And the Jensen store advertised through catalogs. When I talk about the Jensen store, I'm talking about Frederick Lunning's Jensen store in America. In 1947, because of the war, there was a tremendous scarcity of silver, and it was very difficult for Mr. Lunning to maintain the standard of beautiful, handmade quality silver because of the situation, the war situation. So that if you look at the catalogs that he advertised in, and they did most of their business through catalogs or tourists who came to visit the store, Jensen Silver was advertised as imported silver, while the other silver generally stated was that it was made in the style of George Jensen. So it's important to look at the catalogs, and now that there is so much written material about how Jensen developed a market in the United States, it is easy to be aware of what is George Jensen Silver made in USA and George Jensen Silver made in Denmark. And my story is primarily about George Jensen Silver made in Denmark. There's a three-piece dresser set which includes some of the objects and the wide diversity of pieces that Jensen developed. If you think about his aesthetic, that he was compelled to create silver objects to use daily, to be functional, and to add art to your home, you can understand that he was trying to follow through on the arts and crafts concept. And it is very integral to the aesthetic of Jensen silver. At the same time, if you understand the artistic credo of a drawing made by an artist and followed through by the craftsman, in the case of Johann Rode, it's important to look at his drawing because he was an artist and a painter. And the shadowing and the chiaroscuro that he integrated in his drawings was very much reminiscent of the way Jensen handled silver with oxidation. And I do believe that Johann Rode was very impressed with the way Jensen respected the work of the artist, and Johann Rode was very aware of that, and because of that he collaborated with Jensen very early on in his career, and he stayed with him throughout his life. Some of the pieces of hollowware are wonderful indications or examples of the artistry that's incorporated into the functionalism of the piece. As far as the jewelry is concerned, Georg Jensen made hollowware, jewelry, and flatware and treated them all as works of art. It's important to know that every piece of Jensen has a mark, a clear punch mark of the company. Sometimes there are a variety of marks, and there are many pages in the book that will help you to understand the chronology of production. Also, the silver standard is a very good indication of when the piece was made, and I go to great lengths to help the collector understand what the date marks mean. The last picture is of Georg Jensen in his workshop with a tool and hammering on his anvil in his lab coat, and it gives you another indication of how he saw himself. He saw himself as an artist and as a craftsman, and mostly as a sculptor. Georg Jensen created a style. You can read more about Georg Jensen's background in my book, Georg Jensen, A Tradition of Splendid Silver, published in 1997 by Schiffer Publishing, and you can find us on www.druckerantiques.com.